Hey guys, welcome back. Today I'm going to be talking about my favorite way to preserve tomatoes from the garden. We get so many tomatoes, and in my opinion, the easiest and most versatile way to preserve them is freeze drying them. So, in case you're curious how we freeze dry our tomatoes, this is how we do it. This year we're growing mostly paste tomatoes. We have some heirlooms also. That's one thing that I love about this technique is that we just mix up all the varieties of tomatoes that we grow. First thing I do is just give them a rough chop. I kind of cube them. This is kind of the size that I have found works really well. These could be freeze dried in this shape. They could also be blended up, but that's one benefit to the freeze dryer is that we don't have to worry really about the kind of tomato, the water content in the tomato, that kind of thing. All the water is going to be coming out of the tomato, no matter if it's a paste tomato or an heirloom tomato. So the first thing that I do is just gather up all the tomatoes that I am not able to immediately use and I freeze them. Usually the quickest way to freeze them is in the deep freezer. So I just use a regular cookie tray like this and just pop them in the deep freezer. As you can see, we even freeze dry these Lemon Boy tomatoes that I love for fresh eating, but we get too many of them to eat them all fresh. Some people like to separate out the different varieties of tomatoes or the different colors of tomatoes, so you can make a really cool like yellow tomato sauce or yellow tomato paste if you would like, but I just have too many tomatoes to deal with, so roughly every 3 days lately is when I've been doing this, and they all just go into one pile. We end up blending our tomatoes. So I like to think of it as kind of like almost like a 4 cheese blend or something. We have like a 4 tomato blend type paste and sauce that we end up with. So I think it just provides unique flavor. After we freeze them, this is kind of what they look like. So as you can see, this tray that I did was a blend of Lemon Boy, some probably Roma or San Marzano, and there are some cherry tomatoes even in there too. Again, they all just sort of get blended up into a beautiful tomato blend unless we are making some really specific kind of preserve. Now I'm going to take the frozen tomatoes and I'm going to put them in a plastic bag. I do just kind of rinse out these Ziploc gallon freezer bags and reuse them, but if you want to get official reusable bags, you can do that too. Now it's important to note that if you want to freeze dry the tomatoes just straight after picking, you can totally do that. The reason that I am putting these in the deep freezer first and then putting them in these gallon bags is because we share a freeze dryer with our neighbor. So I just find it's easier to transport them if they are just in these plastic bags frozen. And then I sort of break them up like this, so it makes it a little easier for the freeze dryer to get all of the water out of them. The other thing that I can do when I put them in these plastic bags is I can stack them in our freezer more easily that way. So that way I just go to our neighbor's house with 3 or 4 bags of frozen tomatoes and then just pop them all in. As always, I will link our freeze dryer below along with any information. But once the process is complete, this is what they look like. So they are just very, 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 very dry tomatoes, but they maintain their shape unlike dehydrated tomatoes, which I have also done this year, a little bit of dehydrated tomatoes, but freeze drying is definitely preferable. You can store them just like this in this shape and you can rehydrate them really easily. That would be, if you were to add water back to these, it would be probably more like a very chunky tomato sauce. But what I am most interested in is tomato powder today. So I like to make tomato powder because I can make various products out of it. I can make tomato sauce, I can make tomato paste, I can make tomato soup out of it. So tomato powder is just extremely versatile. So as you can see, I'm taking these trays out of the freeze dryer, and I'm just popping all of these freeze-dried tomatoes into a bag. And I don't have to be worried about breaking up the tomatoes or anything as I take them off the trays because it's all going to end up powdered anyway. Oh, by the way, these are some freeze-dried peppers that we had from our garden. So I did a bulk pepper harvest. And I do not grind up these peppers typically for freeze drying, but I am going to save them. I'll show you how I save them. But again, freeze drying is just the easiest way to preserve them, in my opinion. I did the same thing with these peppers. I just chopped them, froze them in the deep freezer, and put them in the freeze dryer. So now we're going to do the powder portion of making the tomato powder. I'm just putting these freeze-dried kind of cubed tomatoes into the food processor, and I'm just going to blend it as finely as possible. Now, you might have noticed somewhere earlier along the way that I did not peel these tomatoes and I did not take the seeds out of these tomatoes. That is personal preference. I love to keep the skins and the seeds in my tomato sauce because they are full of nutrients. I think it's amazing how expensive seeds are. If you think of pumpkin seeds or sunflower seeds, there's some extremely nutrient dense foods and they don't bother me one bit to have in our tomato paste or tomato powder. A lot of them get ground into a really fine dust like this, so we don't even notice them. And then obviously those skins, if you want to take the skins off, you can, but that's just wasteful to me. So we just grind that skin into the powder like the rest of the tomato, and we don't notice them one bit. Again, if that's something that really bothers you, you can go through the process of blanching tomatoes and peeling them and grinding down all of the tomato pulp so that you can keep the seeds out. But those don't bother us at all, and I think it's a great way to get a more nutrient dense and diverse nutrients into our diet. As you can see, everything blended up into a really nice little powder. You will see the occasional little seed here or there, but for the most part, it's a very, very, very fine powder. I'm putting it into a mason jar today. So there are two ways that we will store this. Number one is in a mason jar. I'll show you how we take most of the air out of the mason jar in a second, but it won't keep very long in a Ziploc bag. The Ziploc bag does leak enough moisture and air, so it will start to compromise the freeze-dried tomato powder. So it is important to make sure either a glass jar or a Mylar bag. I've read that the glass jars tend to last roughly a year if they're vacuum sealed, which is what we're gonna do, and kept, and we do keep it in the dark, etc. But if you want something that's gonna last maybe decades, then a Mylar bag is the way to go. We are gonna cycle through these this winter, so this is much less wasteful to us than using a bunch of Mylar bags, but for longer term storage, we would definitely use the Mylar bag. Here is the vacuum hand pump that we use. I prefer a manual hand pump so that if there were no power, I would still be able to use this to store. Obviously, a freeze dryer wouldn't work with no power, but you can still dehydrate food. So I like to have a manual hand pump to get the air out of the mason jars. All I'm gonna do is use this little device to suck most of the air, or as much air as possible, out of the mason jar, leaving that powder inside. Now you do have to be careful because that fine powder can get sucked up into that device. So I try not to fill it too full. The more full you fill it, the more that will be a risk, but this is working well. So as you can see, that little indicator at the top is depressed. So it is sealed really nicely. Sometimes I will move the lid a little bit with my finger. It is really important to make sure that that glass rim is nice and clean because it will be really hard to seal otherwise. But this is a really good use for lids that have already been used for canning maybe once. I will just reuse them for vacuum sealing freeze-dried food or dehydrated food in mason jars, but I will link everything for you below. So I'm gonna do the same thing with our freeze-dried bell peppers. You can store all sorts of freeze-dried and dehydrated food this way. So now I have beautiful tomato powder and freeze-dried peppers, and I know you're curious what the rehydration process is like. A general rule of thumb that I like to use for rehydrating tomato powder is to use a 1-to-1 ratio of water to tomato powder in order to make tomato paste. So 1 tablespoon of tomato powder and 1 tablespoon of water. Stir it around, it reconstitutes into roughly tomato paste. In order to make tomato sauce, I just use a 1-to-2 ratio. So I'm gonna use 1 tablespoon of tomato powder and then 2 tablespoons of water. And then we come out with this beautiful tomato sauce. It rehydrates so quickly and so easily. And side note, I love doing it this way because I never use the amount of tomato paste that comes in the cans. I think this is a much less wasteful way to do it. I can just reseal those jars again. I just take out a tablespoon or a quarter cup, a half a cup at a time, whatever I need for the recipe. Finally, if you're looking for tomato soup, I have heard that a 1-to-4 ratio, so for example, 1 tablespoon of tomato powder to 4 tablespoons of water would give you more of a tomato soup-like consistency. I cannot even imagine having to preserve all of these tomatoes the old-fashioned way, with canning and reducing and blanching and peeling. I have so much respect for all of you who want to do that, especially in the middle of summer when the kitchen is so hot. So mad respect to you, but if you are like me and you are just trying to provide for your family in the least wasteful way possible, and using as much of our own grown produce as you can, then this is a really solid way to do it. I would not be preserving nearly as many tomatoes as we are if it weren't for the freeze dryer and for this process. So I hope this was a little bit helpful for you. I know a freeze dryer isn't in the cards for everybody. Like I said, we share one with another family, so there are definitely a lot of ways to make it more affordable. I actually have a whole video on that if you are interested in some other ideas, but where there's a will, there's a way. And we have found this thing has already paid for itself in the first year. Thanks for watching today, and we'll see you next time.